Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you everybody for this invitation. I'm also honored to follow my very good friend Jungmin Kwan, who is talking to me about her experience joining you a couple of weeks back, I believe. Um, I'm going to start sharing my slides. All right, so my talk today is called Challenging Imperial Evasion in Teacher Education, and a little bit more about my background. I was born in Yemen and lived in Yemen and then in India as well as a child, and then moved to Canada when I was 12 years old. So I actually completed my undergraduate, finished elementary school, started high school, finished high school, and did my undergraduate studies as well as my teacher training in Canada, in London, Ontario. And I've been living in the US since 2007. So I've worked in the United States and I've done my master's and doctorate in the US as well. And I've been working here since. But I mention that because it gives you an idea about my transnational identity. It shows up in my work as well and in my personal commitments. So in addition to thinking about classroom literacy through and supporting, students' literacies through dialogic talk, I also think about the justice-oriented piece of this and how do we make sure that we're both ensuring that our students are that our teaching is both justice oriented and dialogic. And I also have personal commitments and in challenging imperialist narratives and global politics. And so the course that I'm going to be talking to you about today and the work that I'm going to be talking to you about is represents kind of like the merging of the personal and the professional. And so some relevant scholarship here. A lot of this work has been co-authored with my friend and colleague Alex Alweiss, who is also here in the Department of Teacher Education. And so the Imperial Evasion piece that you all read was co-authored with her. And we also have another study under review that I'm going to be discussing today, as well as extended work that she and I are writing up right now. And then I also have some work with my graduate students on the dialogic piece, which I'm also going to be talking to you about as the how to get students to critique and to challenge imperialism and in schooling and beyond. So we know that scholars have shown that discussions of imperialism in general, but also US imperialism in particular, has been largely absent in K-12 and teacher education. Chavez Moreno says that one piece that's been largely missing from critical teacher education's conceptualization of immigrants and migration is attention to contemporary American imperialism. And Shirazi adds that terms like imperialism and empire are neither common in the lexicon of US K-12 teacher education, nor have they appeared as central themes of US historiography. So in particular, I want to highlight this point because what fascinates me, having lived in the US for the past 18 years now, is, the rest of the world sees the US as this empire, right? It's a settler colony. It's built on the settlement and displacement of indigenous folks and the genocide of indigenous folks, and the enslavement of people as well. And yet your average American and even your average educated American won't think of the US as an empire, despite its ongoing imperialistic endeavors, whether it's through coups or regime changes or direct interventions. And so to come to the US and to be thinking about these things in my life constantly, but kind of just not seeing that match up is very interesting. And then, of course, it's not surprising then that this doesn't show up in how we educate teachers. So Alex and I draw on anti-imperial, anti-colonial, and decolonial theories as interconnected traditions forming part of the expansive decolonial archive. And these frameworks help us reveal and challenge the ways in which Western nation states have exerted domination within their borders and beyond. So whether we're thinking about, quote unquote, controlling migration, or really the inhumane practices at the US-Mexico border in particular, or US expansionism and support for regimes that are repressive, or, outward interventions and support for coups and regime change and so forth. And such domination, occurs through these socio-political, military, and economic interventions as well. And Tuck and Reed describe these enduring structures and violence as ongoing horror made visible by its persistence. So this is a violent enterprise. This is not just something that happened in the past and we've moved on for it or we've apologized for. These are ongoing violent structures that unfortunately are enduring and sustained in large part through schooling, but also through media and other forms. And Segato discusses the ways pervasive pedagogies of cruelty that teach and normalize gratuitous colonial violence are used to sustain and uphold the system and ongoing coloniality. So this intentional sustaining of these systems through schooling. We also, through my work, we draw on sociocultural and critical theories of discourse in order to be able to dismantle this kind of ideology in teacher education. And so we think about learning as a social process and highlight the power of dialogue in creating these inclusive spaces. And dialogic talk in particular makes student thinking visible and creates this power sharing frameworks that then enable us to have these rich collaborative learning experience. So it's not this teacher-centered approach, but rather, students are very much the center of these discussions. So I'm going to contrast monologic and dialogic classrooms. In monologic talk, we have the teacher being positioned as the possessor of knowledge, the possessor of truth. And these classrooms tend to be teacher controlled, where there's a lot of closed-ended questions asked. So these are questions that have known answers and a correct response is expected. And this would then, of course, limit opportunities for truly engaging and interacting with the topic, and instead being this top-down system. So Freire discusses banking versus problem-posing education, and he critiques banking model of education and I kind of lifted this quote because many of these points, unfortunately, we still see in schools. So the teacher teaches and the students are taught. The teacher knows everything and the students know nothing. The teacher thinks and the students are thought about. The teacher talks and students listen meekly. The teacher confuses the authority of knowledge with his or her own professional authority, which she and he sets in opposition to the freedom of students. So this is what the banking model of education, Freire writing in 1970 was critiquing. And what we see is that this shows up in classrooms as initiation response evaluation or feedback. So IRE frameworks where these talk patterns are between the teacher initiating a question, the student responding, the teacher evaluating that response, and then moving on to the next student. And what I didn't add here is some statistics about how prevalent this is, at least in the United States, where anytime a large study has tried to see how often dialogic discourse actually occurs in classrooms, they find maybe a few seconds per hour of discussion time. And in my work as well, looking at over 700 classrooms of student discussion, even when the intervention was a discussion-based program, we still see an overwhelming evidence of these IRE frameworks. And, the reason is because we don't really support teachers in thinking about this in teacher education. We don't give them the tools and the skills to be able to engage dialogically with students because we don't maybe value that ourselves as teacher educators. But we also teachers face a lot of restrictions and a lot of constraints. So it takes time to develop ideas dialogically rather than just getting the right answer from students and moving on with our lives. We have these constrained environments that are both politically constrained, especially here in the US, where there are a lot of things that teachers are legislated against speaking about. And we also have time constraints because of high stakes testing environments that are also present in Canada.
Shireen, can you give me 1 second? We had a tech issue and I'm trying to solve it while you speak. Could you give me one moment to solve this problem, please?
Of course.
Okay, I think we're good to go. We want to keep going here. Sorry for the interruption.
No worries. So in contrast, then, dialogic classrooms, they move away from knowledge as being fixed and neutral. There is no such thing as neutral knowledge. And instead, knowledge is co-constructed and contested. So we don't all have to agree, but in fact, we develop, we understand, we have a better understanding of our own positions, or we even adopt new positions, or at least we hear different perspectives when we engage dialogically with one another. There's a critical interrogation of historical narratives, and we center students as co-knowers, collaborators, and co-conspirators. So it's not just a teacher, making all of the decisions. Of course, we are responsible for orchestrating this kind of environment and ensuring that students have the safety and the tools to be able to engage in topics dialogically. But we really center students, their knowledge, their experiences, their thinking through dialogic talk. So the research context of the study is that Alex and I, Dr. Alex Alwise and I, we were second year assistant professors. And I guess the year before, we both checked a box saying, hey, we'd love to teach this class on migration and education. And we got assigned the course, and we ended up redesigning over the summer before we taught it in the fall. So we began looking at it in the spring, and we redesigned the course in order to bring her perspectives that are very anti-colonial, decolonial scholarship, as well as my perspectives and my advocacy and my background in literacy. And we redesigned this course in order to center kind of this anti-imperialist framework. So the course itself is now called Migration Education. It was called something very different before, but it's required for students who are enrolled in a cohort program for our global educators, but it's also open to students across the university and the college. And so we often get students from different departments who are maybe politics majors or sociology majors, and they might be interested in a course like this, or a youth studies minor, for example. And together we taught it in the fall of 2019 and 2020 via Zoom. And then 2021, we had our own separate classes, but we were collaborating, and we aligned our syllabus, and we would combine our classes for certain experiences, for example, going to a museum visit or having guest speakers. And then in 2023, where we also collected data, Alex taught the course on her own. So we foregrounded anti-imperialism as a lens because we realized that you really cannot talk about how do we support an immigrant child sitting in my classroom before first understanding the complexities of how that student got there, and what is the history of migration policy, for example. What are the contemporary realities of border policies, how they changed and shifted or not over the decades. And before we even get to all of that, like, what does it mean to be in a settler colonial state? So we thought we were talking about things that were common knowledge with our students, but we found that we were constantly trying to fill in the gaps, like when our students had no idea what we meant, but when we said, settler colonialism, right? Or even colonialism. And so the second time we taught the course, we said, you know what, let's just bring this up front now that we know what our students know and don't know. And from that time forward, we just made sure that we started at the core of this through an anti-imperial lens that kind of scaffolded students' knowledge throughout the course. So in writing about this work, which was years later, we weren't doing this work so that we could write about it. We were doing this work because we felt it was important. And I found myself at a conference of other educators who also focus on immigrants and migrant youth. And I started talking about this course, and my colleagues were very surprised that I was taking an anti-imperialist lens to talk about these concepts. And so Alex and I got together and we said, maybe this is the time to write about this and study its impact. And so we coined this term imperial evasion. And what we mean by this is that it's the practice of ignoring and or denying pervasive imperialist structures and policies and their impacts on schooling. And it also refers to the silences around and denials of imperialism that are complicit in hiding its pervasive and harmful impacts, and in turn sustaining an avoidance of accountability and systemic transformation. So as you can see, we think of imperialism, the reason it's not there, the reason it's not talked about is because it's actively evaded. And we talk in this paper about how it is evaded. And then in our work, we try to talk also about how we were trying to disrupt these evasions. So I'll start with some student quotes, and this is from a paper that's in progress right now. Um, we had a student say, throughout the course of my life, I have been led to believe certain narratives by the media, schools, and society. I have been taught that certain topics are not discussable within a school setting and that others create a hush at the dinner table. For me, this was really striking because I don't know what it means to not talk about politics at the dinner table. That's all we ever talked about at the dinner table. And so, since I was 6 years old. And so, it continues to fascinate me when my students tell me, for example, when in the events after October 7th, when I asked my students in a literacy class, how are you thinking about what's happening? What are you reading? How are you engaging with these events? And about half the class told me that they grew up thinking that it was rude to talk about politics, and so they just avoided it. And then, of course, we have to think about teaching is a political act, and all of the decisions that we make as teachers are political. And so, like, just even knowing, thankfully, students tell me what's going on so that we can work through those. But this continues to be surprising to me. Another student, Camille, said, I saw it on social media, heard it from peers at school, and even from our news outlets. I was being fed lies regarding immigrants and refugees. Unfortunately, I did not fast check any of these narratives or common myths. I thought I had one more. Oops, sorry. Okay. So we then adopted a collaborative, scholarly, personal narrative to disrupt these imperial evasions. And we lay out three principles, as you read in the paper. The first is challenging and resisting dominant ideologies about US history and society that are rooted in the interconnected structures and ideologies such as imperialism, white supremacy, and settler colonialism. So we just start right there and just, dig into our history as in the history of this country and its impact, its outsized impact on the rest of the world. The second principle is critically interrogating histories in contemporary schooling practices and policies and understandings of schooling as a process of empire building. So schools are not passive agents in this. A lot of this empire building happens through schooling, and we try to help students understand how this occurs. And the third principle is centering and affirming the knowledges and experiences of those most impacted by modern colonial and imperial violence. So how does this shape up then in terms of course materials? So to address the history of land grant institution, we in Michigan State are a land grant institution. And so we have students go to land grab universities. It's a website, and to really understand what it means to be a land grant university on Indigenous land. And we critique the performative aspects of land acknowledgements. And then we also bring in some readings. So Grande discussed the dispossession of Indigenous lands and the role of universities in settler colonial projects. And King examined settler colonial logics and the erasure of Black and Indigenous lives. Our second principle, we examine the history of Native American boarding schools, English-only policies, and linguistic hegemony, U.S. interventions in occupied territories, for example, in the Philippines and Hawaii, but also ongoing interventions like in the war in Yemen, where I'm from, for example. And we also bring in readings from a host of scholars who introduce the concept of the US as an empire. And they also talk about US exceptionalism and how empires sustain through educational policies. And then with our third principle, Gallo has a piece where she talks about gendered experiences of migrant students. Lopez has a really amazing work on immigrant parental involvement in school. Camarota and Aguilera talk about race and language in Arizona schools. And then Thea Abulhaj talks about Arab American students' experiences post 9/11. And then we also have guest speakers, including Maya activists and educators who discussed the linguistic sovereignty and educational injustices from firsthand experiences. So how does this happen on a day to day? I think I just lost my slides. Can you still see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Great. So how does this happen? How in the classroom, we're with our students, how do we actually get them to engage with all of these materials? And this is where dialogic work, dialogic talk comes into focus. So we foster an environment where critical thinking about power, coloniality, and resistance is the norm. And we encourage critical engagement with dominant narratives, so media, politics, history, and making these hidden structures of imperialism visible through talk. And we focus really on stance building that guide pedagogical decisions. This is one of our biggest pet peeves when students on day one want us to just tell them, just tell me what to do with a child in my classroom. And that's honestly pretty disheartening because um, that person is telling us that I don't want to be grounded in any kind of principle. I just want to react to the episodes. And that's not the stance that Alex and I take in our teaching. And so we tell them, we're like, look, we're going to read a book at the end of the class where there's a lot of the how to, but in order to get there, we have to build our own knowledge first, and we have to care enough about, how this child got here. What are the histories and how are we complicit? And what is this country? Where are our tax dollars going? We cannot make these decisions in the moment. We don't know who the students are who are going to be in front of us. Each student is unique and different, and we're going to have to respond differently. But what could guide us in making these decisions are these stances that we build, are these principles that we have that come from knowledge and understanding, what is happening around us, what has been happening, and what continues to happen. So then getting even more specific with talk moves, like the technical how to, we're in a classroom, we have them, do the readings beforehand or watch a video in class. We ask a lot of open-ended questions, and these are questions that are unlike IRE questions where it's a known response. These are contestable questions that prompt open-ended responses and that encourage multiple perspectives. And so how does historical contemporary event X, Y, or Z shape your view about migration or immigration, and why? That's an open-ended question. You can talk to your students and really see how they're making sense of the readings, how they're making sense of the work that you're hoping for them to engage with. There's no point for me to stand and lecture them as I am, I feel like I'm lecturing you right now. Hopefully we'll have a nice dialogic discussion later, but there's no point for me to just stand there and tell them what to think. I want to see how they think. I want to see how they're making sense of the world around them. We also do a lot of pressing for reasoning. So a student says something, and instead of just moving on or not knowing what to do with it, we ask for clarification, expansion. We might ask a question like, why do you think history, they respond to something. Okay, why do you think this history is left out of textbooks? Or, can you say more about this? We also prompt a lot of peer-to-peer engagement. So we want them to engage with what their peers are saying. So instead of an idea just being brought up and then not picked back up, one way to encourage dialogic talk so that the teacher is not constantly the focus of the talk is to just get students to engage with each other. So what do you think about what Sarah just said, for example? And then just active listening moves where we're using like back channeling signals to tell students that we're interested, keep talking, and they're looking for those cues. And this happens whether they're in kindergarten or they're in university. They're looking for signs of interest from the other person that they're talking to, whether it's you or their peers. We really encourage them to just keep talking and expanding. If you want to learn more about dialogic talk moves, you can look at my work in capturing the range of dialogic and talk moves using the low inference discourse observation tool, as well as a study I did with a former graduate student of mine, where we look at how teachers tackle and navigate controversial discussions and what's the role of talk moves in supporting that kind of pedagogy. So following up from the imperial evasion piece, where we really talked about the curriculum and how the curriculum supported the disruption of anti-imperialism, we did a case study where we examined students' course assignments and we also conducted qualitative interviews. So we looked at data from 40 former students. We examined three pieces of written work. So the beginning of the course, we had them reflect in a paper in written form, discussing how personal histories shape their views on migration, immigration, and key readings. The reason we did this at the very beginning of class is because a lot of times we are confronted by shock and really just shock. How come I didn't know about this? And how come I didn't know about this? And I often get my students to kind of look around and say, see, like who's shocked and who's lived this, right? And there's some clear demarcations. And so I say, okay, well, we're going to deal with the shock and the surprise, and we're going to try to make sense of our own histories and how we got here in this written reflections, but we must move past the shock into really trying to expand our knowledge and move toward action. So then in the middle part of the course, they do a critical media reflection piece where they choose a media artifact and then they discuss the policies that it engages with, the strengths and the shortcoming of the piece, and then the broader impact. And we model this throughout the course. Every day when they come in, we choose a something in the news segment, basically either a short video or an article that relates to topics in the class, and then we help them critically engage with that media piece, to not take anything for granted, but to really examine something very critically. So to build the critical literacy around media, and then they get to do that with their own midterm assignment. And then at the end of the course, they do a film project where they choose from a list of movies, films that used to be books, and then we move to films about the topics that we discuss in class, and then they also make pedagogical and institutional recommendations. And we also interviewed 10 former students about their experiences with the course, 30-minute semi-structured interviews, and students from all iterations of the course were interviewed. By the time they were interviewed, some of them were already student teachers, some of them were in the graduating this year or last year. So some findings about the disruptions of imperial evasion. So one of the findings is that, students were making sense of the challenging dominant ideologies. So Violet said, my idea of our political parties changed. I learned that the American empire is not a right-wing or Republican effort. It continues to be the American legacy on all fronts. Across these conversations, I wondered, what is our government value more than life? Our imperial interest in this case and many others is profits and power, regardless of the toll of human life. What Violet is getting at here is that we really try to disrupt students' partisan, binary, Democrat good, Republican bad idea of imperialism, because the reality is that when you look across history and you look at the impact of imperialism, US imperialism in particular, on the rest of the world, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to see which party at the time was Democratic, which party was Republican. This is a shared effort, and we see that through migration policies over the decades, for example. And Tracy also said, now you still see the effects of colonialism everywhere, but you see a lot with specifically the US and South America, and we're wondering, how did we get to this crisis? And I'm like, y'all, it's us. The fire is, or the call is coming from the house. And we actually use the call is coming from the house as the title of this paper that's currently under review, because it really captured what we were trying to help students see. Schools as sites of imperialism, Bree reflected that American exceptionalism is the reason why many negative things in our collective past are not taught in school or even discussed. Our country tries to hide the bad we do by not talking about it, so future generations never learn about our negative history. Another piece that I hadn't considered was how the whitewashed history that's taught in schools might conflict with the history of immigrant students' culture. The things they learn in class may not be what they know to be accurate. And this was a reflection from Ethan. And our second finding was that we found students being driven toward advocacy and accountability. Malika said, I had seen the news headlines about the kids in cages. This was during 2020, and the class was on Zoom. And the Trump election had just happened, but the migration crisis was front and center in the news every day. And she said, and naturally felt outraged, but in many ways I felt powerless in this situation. I figured that as a Black woman, my hands were already full with trying to make this a truly equitable place for myself and my community. This class so far has opened my eyes to the ways that this truly is my burden to bear as well. And this was in a reflection that she wrote in the first 4 weeks of the class. And Felicity said, as someone who recognizes their whiteness but refuses to use that inherited privilege as an excuse to naiveness or ignorance, being properly informed and knowledgeable on the topic of current U.S. immigration events, as well as historical policies in the U.S. on immigration, it's something I hold myself accountable to. The third finding was that we found, of course, continued evasions. And this is only expected given that we're trying to undo and really get students to adopt maybe a different perspective that they hadn't considered before. But they're not getting, they have had a lifetime of thinking about certain things in a certain way. So we had some direct resistance. So, for example, Dallas wrote, this may seem like a cold and heartless message to give to desperate families in Latin America, but federal authorities on the border and governments of big cities are having more and more difficulty processing the sheer mass of new immigrants. America is a land of law and order. Dallas, in particular, is responding to an event where, at the time, she was Vice President Harris, Kamala Harris. She went to Guatemala and gave a speech in Guatemala, and she said, do not come to the United States. And in class, we were trying to get them to understand, we had been reading about the history of multiple coups and following genocide in Guatemala, and these coups were supported by the United States. And so to create the conditions that drive people to leave only to shut your border when seeking asylum is an international right. We were trying to get students to understand the cruelty of this. And Dallas was, of course, still focused on the law and order piece. But we also had indirect resistance, which we term individualizing the systemic. So students were more comfortable going back to, let's just be nice, just be a good person, as though we can, solve institutional problems and systemic problems through individual responses. Julia said, we as future teachers need to accept diversity and make the environment welcoming and comfortable for students' language, beliefs, and cultural practices to be accepted. Of course, we need to do that. That is a given, but that shouldn't be the response to these systemic injustices and cruelties. And so some implications and reflections. This reveals the ways imperialist narratives and imperial evasions pervade and shape public and educational spaces and discourses. Our work highlights ways to resist and disrupt these evasions through research, advocacy, and practice. But it really does require sustained and intentional commitment and effort to disrupt these discourses. It doesn't just happen on day one, and it might not even happen at the end of the semester. We try to do this, by the way, through the entire global cohort experience, where they take 4 courses. This is the third in the sequence. So we're hoping to build some kind of critical understanding by the end of students' time in the global cohort. But like I said, the course is also open to everybody, and we don't always succeed. And it can be separated from and must be included within broader social justice frameworks and goals. So how often do you hear about anti-imperialism as being a part of social justice? Maybe not often enough. So there's a lot of tension in doing this work in teacher preparation programs, given the complicity of schools and also the lack of continuity across the program. There's the dialogic instruction piece, which provides a pathway for critical engagement with imperialism and its effects. And like I said earlier, we really focus on stance building rather than providing a set of practices. Educators, we believe, and researchers ground their work in anti-imperialist pedagogies and principles through purposeful, ongoing engagement in historical and current sociopolitical events. As stressful and as difficult it is to turn on the news or to look at my phone as I'm speaking to you right now, my family in Yemen is going through airstrikes that are ordered by the Trump administration, and this is part of a decade-long campaign of bombing Yemen. As difficult as it is for me to pick up my phone each time and check if everybody's okay, these are things that I need to be constantly, not maybe constantly, but I need to be engaged in and engaged in critically so that it could come into my work instead of pretending that it doesn't exist. There also has to be an intentional selection and integration of curriculum materials that address US imperialism and challenge dominant ideologies, and to dialogically create these environments where students can engage with one another and to engage with colleagues to understand and to grapple with historical and current events and power relations. I started a monthly series called Global Justice Dialogues, and once a month, graduate students and faculty and staff come together and we have the space where we can make sense of what's happening in the world around us and the implications it has in our own teaching and our practice, especially with teacher educators who are going to go on and, teach our little ones. And I'm going to leave you with this quote. This is again from a paper that we're currently writing. Marin says, I remember the big thing that stuck out to me is the continuation of imperialism, colonialism in the way we teach and the way we expect students to behave. That stuck out to me because that's like, oh, I'm a teacher and I have a part in that very directly. I feel like school is a very real way in which imperialism and colonialism are perpetuated. And the US is not someone who helps. I think it was a very good moment of like, I am an active agent in this, and the things I do have consequences. As a teacher, I need to be thinking of that. And I need to be very conscious of how I'm structuring things and what I'm teaching and how I'm teaching them to try to minimize that. Education is very much an active tool of imperialism. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.